I carry a lot more than these blades. Balance be damned! Wipe them out! None can do what I do, so I will do it. If they capture me, they'll kill me. If.
Over the past decade, out of all the reworks the game has witnessed, few were as tumultuous as Irelia's. Her past is one of controversy, to say the least. Even prior to her relaunch in spring of 2018, she was notorious for being difficult to handle and had a playstyle that made her simple to understand, yet hard to judge in terms of relative strength. During a period of the game's history when large numbers of champions were being retrofitted, Irelia was also intended to receive the same treatment, and contrary to popular belief, they more than succeeded in that venture. Except it was a bit of an overcorrection, for lack of a better term. Visual gameplay updates at the time have been given virtually uncontested approval by the community, mostly because we were excited to see how samey, redundant stat checkers would turn out with the new, more skill-expressive playstyles. Then came Irelia's turn, leading many of us to second guess just how flawless Riot's track record really was in terms of updating older champions. This would be the first one where the response from the majority of the player base was rather mixed. So how about we dance around the very complicated history that is Irelia's Rework, a retrospective. So during the early days of League, champion designs were very cookie cutter. It was a pretty common occurrence for someone to have noticeably similar attributes and/or playstyles than other members in the game's roster. There was no subclass that demonstrated this more than melee auto attackers, also referred to as duelists, which was before it became skirmishers. I did bring this up in my episode on Aatrox, so this might be familiar to you if you watched that one. Most of the times when you think of stat checkers nowadays, the first ones to come to mind are perhaps Garen, Malphite, maybe Mordekaiser. But back then, the most infamous ones were Fiora, Irelia, Jax, Master Yi, Xin Zhao, and the like. The design philosophy was simple. Their primary source of damage would be auto attacks, and the rest of their abilities were designed to augment their attack power through on-hit bonuses and to make it easy for them to apply auto attacks in quick succession. As a result, each member of the duelist class would have a kit that looked something like this: a gap closer or a mobility spell, a defensive parry or lockdown ability, and a self buff in some way, shape, or form. This was put in place to give duelists everything they needed to excel in their field of interest. The gap closer would make them a veritable threat regardless of whether their opponent was ranged or melee. As for the defense or lockdown ability and self-buff, those would accentuate their threat capacity by increasing their pressure while mitigating their opponents. In other words, to match a duelist in single combat, you either had to be a duelist yourself or gang up on them in a 2v1. You can sort of draw a parallel to that of Dragon-type Pokemon. They start off weak due to their lack of intrinsic might and require a substantial amount of time and resources to reach their final form. Once they did, however, oh boy, never a better time than now to pick a god and pray. That is of course unless you have a fellow Dragon-type on your side as well. Irelia was the poster child in that regard, someone whose objective was to force a one-on-one confrontation with you, then beat you down with a superior stat line and combat pressure. I say force because she was the only duelist who actually became stronger the more opponents that were facing her. Ionian Fervor granted her bonus tenacity based on how outnumbered she was. Pair this up with Merc Treads and all hard crowd control would be half as effective on her. And that's a huge deal if you think about it. If Irelia was 1v2ing the enemy ADC and support, things like Morgana Q, Ashe Arrow, Caitlyn Traps, Leona Stuns would last far shorter. This mattered a lot since the only way you can easily neutralize a duelist is through crowd control. Technically, crowd control counters everyone, but it matters much more against the likes of her. Now remember the three things we need: gap closer, self-buff, and defense/lockdown. Blade Surge is Irelia's mobility, a point-and-click dash that deals damage and applies on-hit effects. Adding on to that, it was the only gap closer among his peers that reset on kill, allowing her to use it as many times as she wanted provided it deals the killing blow each time. Because of this, the possibility that she could dash to a low health target then on you was very much real, extending her threat bubble much more than that of other duelists. What's interesting about Irelia's Gap Closer is that it was the only one of its kind that dealt on-hit effects. No other duelist had a dash with that property. This meant Blade Surge can apply Spell Blade, items like Blade of the Ruined King, Lifesteal, or even crit strikes. Conveniently, her self-buff would help her do just that. Hidden Style had a passive component that would restore health with every basic attack. That includes Blade Surge. When activated, the restoration doubled and she would deal bonus true damage on hit. With one usage of her W against a large wave of minions, you basically had to kill her in one shot or else she would heal back all her health in the neutral. Every time she attacks, she heals. This kind of sustain was risky to give to a champion like her. It's one of the reasons why a lot of modern day skirmishers only have healing elements against champions in combat, such as Fiora, Lilia, and Gwen. I'm going to go into that in further detail when we discuss her rework. Next we need her defensive parry/lockdown tool, and yeah, let's just say hers was pretty dang busted, not gonna lie. Equilibrium Strike did magic damage to her target and slowed them for up to 2 seconds, but if her percent current health was equal or lower than that of her target, that 1 to 2 second slow would become a 1 to 2 second point and click stun. The only stipulation attached to that is that your health bar has to be more empty than your opponent, or both have to be at full HP. This ability essentially punished you for attacking first, but against someone with high front-loaded burst damage like Irelia, attacking second would be just as bad. Do any of you notice something within her kit that's absent from Fiora, Jax, Tryndamere, or Master Yi? Front-loaded damage. Despite having the same ability structure as the Skirmisher, despite building the same sort of items as the Skirmisher, Irelia's kit feels more like a diver, doesn't it? The duelist archetype is known for many things. Burst damage is not one of them. Although, aside from a certain someone, but we've been through this like a dozen times already. Some of them may have patterns that apply a high amount of damage quickly, but there usually has to be some sort of setup beforehand. A typical trade combo with Jax is to auto-attack minions twice, then walk up to your lane opponent and hit them with the 3-hit passive from Grandmaster's Might, plus Empower for a big chunk of damage. But that requires him to hit twice before. Gwen's Q can hurt a lot, but she has to get 4 auto attacks in beforehand. Same goes to Riven, 3rd cast of Broken Wings plus auto then key strike for another auto before dashing away. That's because skirmishers are not designed for front-loaded damage, that's the assassin or diver's job. Irelia was. She could dash to a caster minion, then cast Equilibrium Strike on you, then activate Hidden Style for a couple auto attacks before using Blade Surge, now empowered with true damage, for big damage. And it was very easy to pull off considering nothing had to build up to that point. The only condition being her health percentage had to be equal or less than yours. The ultimate was the second part of her kit that made her more dangerous to deal with if you tried to gang up on her. Transcendent Blades threw 4 Spirit Blades one after another, each doing physical damage to all enemies they pass through, while healing her for a percentage of the damage dealt. Against just one opponent, she won't heal for very much, but in a team fight, each blade can probably regenerate hundreds of health, and she has 4 of them. Irelia's old kit was very stat-checky in nature. Her passive and W gave her a myriad of useful stats: tenacity, true damage, and on-hit lifesteal. Her Q and E were both point and click, the latter directly interfacing with her current health relative to her opponents. Her ultimate, while a skill shot, was designed to increase her combat pressure linearly through damage and healing, and was extremely consistent at that. Everything about Irelia was very intuitive to understand, and that's why she was a consistently popular top laner and a widely frustrating one at that. It may seem like a head-scratcher that Irelia was subject to a gameplay overhaul while Jax, Master Yi, and Tryndamere remain unchanged to this day. That's due in part to the fact that, unlike other reworks up until now, Irelia was too good at what she did. There wasn't anything particularly wrong about her design back then. Each of her abilities meshed well with one another. She had a strong mid-game and good carry potential in solo queue, while also being fun to play if we ignore the fact that her old queue was pretty inconsistent at resetting on minions. As mentioned before, she was a stat checker with a dash that could reset on kills, a duelist who actively grew stronger when outnumbered, had front-loaded damage and sustained in neutral, and was a diver with the kit of a skirmisher. All things considered, she had no major weaknesses beyond the limitations of any champion. Her innate scaling as a whole wasn't very good, as neither Hidden Style's regeneration nor true damage scaled in any way, but since it was a non-hit property, building attack speed would technically count as scaling, and since Blade Surge applied on-hit effects, it was a perfect choice for Spellblade. Veteran players may remember the better nerf Irelia meme. I guess in some ways you could think of her as the 200 years champion before 200 years became a thing. Maybe not overloaded, but she was certainly overtuned. Wouldn't be the most unreasonable thing to say that she had arguably one of the most dangerous mid-games in all of League's history. While every other duelist was still trying to scale up their attack speed, damage, and such, Triforce was all Irelia really needed to get going. She could rely on her base damage from Hidden Style to do the rest. This was acknowledged by Riot's own design team, and I quote, "Her thematic fantasy promises a highly agile warrior that uses multiple telekinetic blades to vanquish her foes. Yet outside of her ultimate, she doesn't really have any abilities that are delivering on that fantasy, and even her current ult falls a bit flat compared to modern champion designs. Her kit is very reliable, which leads to uninteresting stat checks and makes her more snowball reliant than she should be. That is a pretty apt way to describe old Irelia. She was a very consistent stat checker with less matchup dependence, as she could go toe-to-toe with ranged champions in light of her dash resets. With all that in mind, enter current Irelia. The primary goals I'm assuming Riot was aiming for were to give her more skill expression, make her combos less linear and unconditional. Credit where credit is due, the transformation she went through was almost flawless. Keyword, almost. Irelia's new gameplay feels a lot like the original. It has the same rushdown playstyle and makes better usage of her levitating blades in every conceivable way. They wanted to axe all semblance of stat checking and make her someone who, when championed by a skilled player, could single-handedly turn entire games around. That was what her lore was about after all. She was a one-man army, and this almost neurotic push to achieve that goal resulted in Riot going too far for her rework. New Irelia does have much lower lows than before. It's very easy for the majority of her pressure to be made almost non-existent. Conversely, her highs have reached astronomical levels. When used optimally, Irelia may very well have no defining weakness. Ionian Fervor was completely changed. Now in a similar fashion to Jax's Relentless Assault or Kael's Divine Ascent, Irelia gains a stack of Ionian Fervor for every champion hit by her abilities, or if she hits at least one non-champion, stacking up to 4 times. She then gains bonus attack speed with each stack and bonus magic damage on hit at max stacks. So they got rid of Hit and Style's true damage and replaced it with magic damage, but it now scales off bonus AD. On top of that, she received a huge amount of free attack speed. Irelia no longer has the bonus tenacity, but I mean for all this, that is most definitely a worthwhile trade-off. Hidden Style's healing component was instead given to Blade Surge, which is much less base damage and healing, although the healing now scales based on her attack damage. So when you see 16% of her AD, that's essentially the same as Blade Surge having 16% pre-mitigation lifesteal. It still has the reset component on enemy kill, but they added another way to reset its cooldown. Whenever she uses Blade Surge on anyone marked as unsteady by her E or ultimate, it resets. Irelia can now use her dash multiple times on a single target without explicitly killing them, thus increasing her combat mobility and burst damage even further. Equilibrium Strike was replaced with Flawless Duet, which is no longer point and click and stuns for much less, but Irelia is now able to cast this from a farther distance, and it can strike any number of targets between the 2 blades. For each enemy champion or large monster hit, that's a free reset for Blade Surge. Without even looking at her W and ultimate, something is made very clear. Irelia's consistent uptime has become even more consistent. Old Irelia's gameplay was linear, unfair in certain cases, but ultimately linear. If you kept track of the limits of what she could do and acted accordingly, you would prevail 10 times out of 10. The options you had against her versus that of other skirmishers weren't as straightforward, but they were there. For example, once Irelia casted Blade Surge to close the distance on you, she was fully vulnerable to any form of counterattack for a good 4 to 5 seconds before her dash came back up, and that was your opportunity to strike back. With her new abilities, she would not only be more versatile in 1v1s, but exponentially more of a problem in teamfights. A single well-positioned cast of Flawless Duet or entrapping the entire enemy team within Vanguard's edge meant that her once one-and-done usage of Blade Surge can now potentially be recast 10 times over. Mind you, that's only in perfect conditions, but still. Everyone's frustration with Irelia was that she could do too much for so little effort. They felt like she shouldn't be able to have this much consistency, and so her power lost a lot of its unconditionality. Now she doesn't just get free stats with the press of a button, you have to build them up through her passive. She doesn't get a free point and click stun now, you have to aim the 2 blades to intersect through your targets. Yes, she's a lot more conditional, but the reward for meeting those conditions has been dialed up to such a degree that it almost defeats the purpose of mitigating her average performance rate. Think of it like this, old Irelia's range of performance was 80 to 120%. At worst, she's 80% her maximum strength, and at best, she was 120. New Irelia was more like 40 to 160. Her average number still holds at around 100% just like the old one, but she now has the potential to do far more than her old version ever could, which at higher levels of play is a very desirable thing to have. This is just looking at her as she is now. Oh my word if you saw her on Rework release. Her passive did bonus damage to shields at max stacks because why the hell not? W cut all physical and magic damage by over half. Flawless Duet used to stun for 1.2 seconds instead of 0.75 and had a target range of over 900, allowing her to stun even Ezreal, and Vanguard's Edge would lock you out of using basic attacks if you touched the cage. She was both overloaded and overtuned. Most, if not all of her nerfs did little to change how good she was. They only narrowed her margin for error. Typically, when a champion gets hit with a slew of nerfs but still feels oppressive to go up against, that's because their power lies not in their numbers but their execution. One of the most noteworthy and hilarious examples of this was on patch 8.21, when Riot thought taking away 5 base movement speed would matter in the slightest. Okay, I'm just kidding. That's just a meme for the sake of being a meme. An example would be her recent adjustments in Season 11. As I'm sure many of you recall, Irelia received a gameplay adjustment midway through the season in the hopes that it would bring her back a bit in performance. But in usual fashion, they ended up overbuffing, and so they had to rein her a bit in with lower numbers. 11.15 saw Defiant Dance's damage reduction and damage output reduced. 11.17 lowered her Blade Surge healing by a substantial amount, and Ionian Fervor lost 10% bonus AD in damage. Those changes don't really matter in the grand scheme of things because none of those are conducive to Irelia's overall performance. She may have a bit less sustain in lane, but it wasn't their Q that made her fully heal off of one wave, at least not entirely. It was her Vamp Scepter rush in conjunction with the passive healing. Same thing for Defiant Dance. Losing a bit of damage and a token amount of damage reduction doesn't change the fact that it can adequately protect her from heavy returning fire, extend the duration of Ionian Fervor in the neutral, and or last hit minions from a distance. That's what I mean when I say her rework went too far. Thematically speaking, they more than accomplished their goal of making her this whirling rushdown diver who overwhelms opponents with equal parts speed and force. But her kit, while now very dependent on skill expression, has given her far too much potential in sheer coverage. She can 1v1, she can assassinate, she can teamfight, she can split push, she can go bruiser, on hit, a myriad of different items. She went from pretty much exclusively a top laner to a flex pick in both top and mid, a mid-game beast to someone who's basically good at all stages of the game, just an overall hyper-consistent champion, attesting to her near perpetual double-digit pick rate ever since her relaunch. The argument of whether or not this is a good or bad thing can be pretty divisive. On one hand, the only thing really holding her down is how hard she is to play. She does have an incredible amount of innate strength, but it's ridiculously hard to tap into at an optimal level all the time. On the other hand, it means that if someone is dedicated or talented enough to min-max the crap out of her, there's almost nothing she can't do. In that case, what determines if they're at a healthy spot in the game when it comes to balance depends on statistics. Irelia, Akali, Jace, Ryze, etc. will always have win rates below 50% despite being powerful and widely used, since more players are inting on them than carrying. That too can be hard to balance correctly because it segues into the burning question: where should they be? Is Irelia in a healthy spot at 48%, 50%, 46%? It's much harder to tell for champions like her. For the vast majority of players, Irelia isn't quote-unquote fair unless her average win rate is like 40%. It's very subjective. In the end, her rework is the first significant instance of Riot trying to do too much for a champion, possibly coinciding with 2018 being the year that kicked off the trend of introducing questionably overloaded champions like Sylas, Kai'Sa, Pyke, and all the ones they came after. But what are your thoughts on this? Do you believe Irelia's older version was better or her new one? I'm kind of torn myself. I actually really loved old Irelia, but there were admittedly a lot of issues. Same goes to the new one. Anyways, this video is going kinda long, so I'll end it off here. If you enjoyed today's episode, it would be awesome if you left a like and subscribed. Consider following me on Twitter, joining my Discord server, and checking out my other Rework Retrospectives if you haven't yet. But for now, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you for the next episode, which will be on York. Take care.